Howdy folks, I'm Hank Sheffer, and welcome to another true life story right here with Larry Hedrick on Mysteries of the Superstition Mountains.
A couple of months ago, the film crew for Mysteries of the Superstition Mountains was up at Superior to do a lead-in at Apache Leap. We figured by the time that we done the story that the documents that we knew about from the archaeological project that was done at Apache Leap would be available to us. However, that never came to fruition. And we didn't get real deep into the story because we knew it was going to come to pass. And now we're here to report on the finding of that project. I was getting no response from emails and phone calls trying to find that paper. But Jack Sanfelice suggested that I call Jack Carlson. And he thought that Jack Carlson would know the archaeologist. Well, Jack not only knew the archaeologist, he had a complete copy of the project and was very gracious to send it to me. So I've been studying it for some time, and I believe that this paper, as I thought it would, has resolved the mystery of Apache Leap. I was convinced that whatever caliber shells that were cartridges that were found during that search would answer the question of the date that this occurred. Because in a speech that the archaeologist had made in a Tempe Historical Society, he mentioned that the cartridges that were found did not match the date that was commonly given for Apache Leap. And that it was the year 1871, which would have put this in the time period of General Stoneman at Camp Pennell. As it turns out, there were two battles fought at the site of Apache Leap, one below the cliffs and one up on top of the cliffs. A couple of names surfaced that really surprised me, and you might recognize from other episodes that we've done on Picacho Pass. Because the first battle took place in 1866 and was led by a man named John D. Walker. Walker was part of the California column that came in here in 1862 to deal with the Confederates that were in Tucson. He was the wagon master for the entire California column. There must have been a lot of them because when the Battle of Picacho Pass was over, Captain Hunter sent Lieutenant Tevis up to find out what happened to his missing men, and he saw 272 soldiers and 10 wagons going back to the Pennell villages. So that left about 2,000 more soldiers coming up the Gila River, and obviously there must have been an awful lot of wagons involved. And that position called for the rank of a lieutenant. Well, when they got to the Sackatone villages, Lieutenant Walker was in charge of distributing the grain from the Maricopa and Pima Indians. They had huge fields of grains to the soldiers. They were buying them from the Indians and shipping them to various places where the California column was, as far away as El Paso. Well, after the war was over, Walker came back to the Pima villages. He was very friendly with the Indians, and he continued doing business with them. And in fact, he formed a militia unit out of the Pima and Maricopa Indians. The Apaches had been committing great depredations against the Pimas and the Maricopas, and they were really tired of it. So he formed a militia unit and was cooperating with Fort McDowell, which was established in 1865. Lieutenant Ewing came with a small contingent of soldiers to the Pima villages and met with Captain Walker, who had formed this militia unit, and they left the Pima villages with 300 Maricopa and Pima Indians and marched 22 miles to what would have been Florence up the Gila River and beyond. And they crossed the river and camped the night, and it was stated in his report, which was a very accurate and complete report, that at that point the Indians began making war clubs. The Indians evidently were not heavily armed or didn't particularly care to be, so they were making war clubs for what was coming up ahead. They marched 25 miles north of the Gila River, which would have put them very close, if not in Queen Valley, where there was permanent water. And then the forces split. Lieutenant Ewing took half the troop and went on up into the Tonto Valley. And Walker took his group and went 15 miles east. And that put them right where Superior would be. And during the night, they snuck up on this Apache ranch area and was waiting for them by dawn. The fight started, and they killed 25 Apaches without any casualties on the sides of the Indians. Nothing else was accomplished at this particular battle, and it was below the cliffs, not up on top of the cliffs. The women and children were taken captive. The bodies were just left where they fell, and the captives were turned over to the army at Fort McDowell. And that was the end of the 1866 raid. The next raid, and this was also documentation that was found in the Army annals, happened in June of 1869. This was led by Lieutenant Colonel Sanford, and they left Fort McDowell, went up the Salt River to the Tonto Basin where Roosevelt Lake would be, and dropped south down Pinnell Creek through Globe on down to Fort Grant. And from Fort Grant, where they re-outfitted, they worked their way north to the Pinnell Mountains, and in the dark came upon the rancheria that was on top of the cliff. And the name that came up, there were three groups of mostly soldiers. There was no mention of Pima or Maricopa Indians being in this particular group. It was mostly all soldiers. And there was three groups of them. All the outfits were named, which I can't put to memory. And they combined into two groups, and one of them was led by none other than Lieutenant William McLeave. If you might remember in our episode of Picacho Pass, he was a captain who was captured by Captain Hunter and his Confederates and taken with Emil White, who owned the mill there, to Mesilla. Now he was a lieutenant. I don't think that meant that maybe he was demoted because he was captured. I think probably he was a brevet captain at the time of the Civil War, and now that the war was over, he was back to his original rank as lieutenant. Anyway, he made the initial contact, and the rancheria buildings and weapons and what they found was completely destroyed, and there were about 75 Apache casualties in this battle. Absolutely no mention in either one of these reports said anything about the Apaches jumping over the edge or committing suicide or being thrown over the edge. What information I've been able to gather, there's a couple of other things that happened in Arizona that people thought that the Indians committed suicide. One of them was when General Cook took over. He was on an inspection tour, and he was returning from Fort Apache to Camp Verde. And his party was attacked by 30 or 40 Apaches. And a couple of them got separated during the fight and were over on the edge of the Mogollon Rim. And the firing was so heavy, they just jumped over the edge. And everybody thought that they committed suicide. Well, eventually they walked over there to look down and see the remains, and there they both were, almost this sheer cliff, bounding from boulder to boulder, making their escape. Another incident happened at Turk Peak, which is not far from where the first one took place. And there again, stories were circulated that some of the Apaches jumped over the edge. Absolutely, there was no eyewitnesses to any of this, that this is just something that local legend has put out there. The ammunition that was found, the cartridges were mostly heavily 50-70 caliber, which goes right along with the standard weapon that they were using at Skeleton Cave, which was the modified Sharps carbine, modified from paper cartridges to brass cartridges, and fired 50-70 caliber. There was a very small number of 56-50 caliber shells found, which would have been used in a Spencer carbine. And the information was suggesting that some of the Indians were armed with Spencers. Now, where would they have got these? The governor had ordered in 500 Spencer carbines to be issued to civilians for their self-defense. And probably the Indians got those from civilians when they went on raids. The cartridges were out of date. They are no longer manufactured by 1869. And when I was doing the story on the search for Dr. Thorne's mine with Cooley, Cooley met up with some Indians at that time that had figured out a way to save their brass and reload them. In fact, one Indian showed him some metal that he had, how he shaped these bullets. And it turned out that that metal was a almost pure silver nugget. And they actually made the bullets to fit the gun. And if you ever saw an Indian make an arrowhead and how perfectly they can do this, you can understand that it would not necessarily be a difficult thing for an Indian to fashion a silver bullet to fit the weapon that he had. The big problem was the primer. An Indian couldn't go buy a primer to fit that military or civilian gun, so what they did, evidently powder was not hard to get, and caps for cap and ball pistols were not that hard to get. So they took the smallest caps that would be used on a pistol and crushed them down into the primer hole. And then I'd done a little reloading in my time. In a primer, there's a little piece in there called an anvil. And that's what actually detonates the powder that's in the primer. So they took a small rock and put it on top of these crushed caps as the anvil, and then crushed some more caps in there until it was smooth on the back of the cartridge. So Indians were pretty clever in figuring this out. So evidently there were some of them armed at Apache Leap. So really, as it comes down to it, the only conclusion that I'm going to make that has nothing to do with the reports is that articles that claim that the bones of Indians could still be found there after several years could have only possibly been the 25 Indians that were killed in the first raid and just left where they fell. Or else there was just a complete exaggeration. But anyway, the two battles that took place, and the one battle in 1869 by Captain McLeave, Lieutenant McLeave, is, in my opinion, completely solved the mystery of the Apache Leap.
Thank you for watching this episode of Mysteries of the Superstition Mountains.